The idea is that the U.S. and Ukraine will have some sort of joint investment fund, and it's going to be forever. The U.S. can make payment in the form of weapons. This agreement appears anyway, because again, we don't know all the details, appears to give the U.S. a powerful incentive to stay there and even to expand, Ukrainian territory at the expense of Russian control. Because as things stand, the Russians control about 40% of the natural resources. It's not just minerals, but at least 40% of the natural resources that would be covered by this deal. And that number is increasing. With every Russian advance, they get more of that territory, more of those natural resources. So it gives the U.S. and Donald Trump in particular an incentive to really support the Ukrainians and to push back the Russians. And what I'm afraid is that, okay, Trump, again, I think he really did he really wanted peace. I think that's true. But he also just really wanted a deal, something that he can say, look what I did. And then, bring it back as to say, this remarkable achievement of mine. And I think maybe the Ukrainians have given him that. And he may just latch onto that and make that, and declare that that's his solution to the problem, or that's his great achievement, and then actually renew his commitment to Ukraine, because all the incentives, if in fact he's really serious about this deal, all the incentives are on that side.
Right. This deal doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So the idea was that the U.S. would begin to go in and develop mining facilities, whatever it is, rare earth refinement in Ukraine. I mean, this is would be a lot of capital, take a lot of time, I imagine. I mean, these things you don't just get a shovel and dig them out of the ground.
Right.
Otherwise, they would have been done already. Clearly,
Right.
This is not something that's easy to do.
Yeah.
So the idea, it could take a decade or something to build stuff like this.
It
Right?
clearly could. Right. Yeah, it's going to take time. And right now it's impossible. Ukraine's at war. I mean, it can't be done. So it's kind of pie in the sky sort of stuff. That's true. And then if you freeze you can say, well, this gives an incentive for him to push for a ceasefire, because only under his ceasefire conditions would this plan really be implemented. But on the other hand, it also gives them an incentive to try to push back the Russians, which it's been proven to be just impossible. Again, real attempts, enormous efforts were made in that direction, and they failed miserably. Again, the summer 2023 offensive is the best example of that. But it does give the U.S. an incentive to push back the Russians, because the Russians have almost half of those natural resources that would be covered by the deal anyway. So anyway, that's where we are.
Right. I heard that Donbass actually has the most wealth. That the Russians, maybe it's half of the resources approximately, but I think it's the more valuable resources. I heard something about.
Yeah. No, I think that's clear. And so I mean, I've heard the 40% figure, but earlier I've heard 50 or better percent. It's a huge, Donbass has the greatest mineral wealth. There's no question about it. That's one reason why Donbass has been difficult for the Russians to take, because there are a lot of mines there. Often, many of these battles were fought around mines, or on these huge slag heaps, that are again kind of the a byproduct of mining and of smelting and all these other industrial processes. So the Russians have already taken most of the Donbass, and they're poised to take the rest of it. It's expected that they'll probably take the rest of at the current rate, they'll probably take all of the Donbass by the end of this year or early next year. And of course, it could go faster if we see a collapse.
So is this a done deal? You said there are 3 documents. The main one was signed. I mean,
this is what there was supposed to be. There were these rumors that the Ukrainians were refusing to sign 2 of the documents, and the Americans said, "You better sign all 3 of them, right now, together at the same time, or you're not getting this agreement." And then what we've heard is that one document was signed, and that has been published in Ukraine. Again, it's lacking in detail. It's sort of, again, it's not a full contract. When you're talking about, an investment contract, it needs to be very detailed. The devil's always in the details. You have to, it's explained, it said that they're supposed to be joint control. What does that really mean? How do you ensure that? How is that even possible? If you have 50% and 50%, well, how are decisions going to be made when there's a disagreement? All those things have to be worked out, and they're not worked out in the agreement that was shown. Well, okay, so the one document was published, but then the other two that were supposed to be signed haven't been. Maybe they have been signed, but they haven't been published yet. And we don't really know exactly what they're about. It seems all in all, I mean, this agreement appears to have dropped let's say, really the most outrageous demand on the part of Trump, which was that, okay, you need to pay us back for the $350 billion that he says we gave to them. Now, he seems to be the only one that claims there's 350. I don't know how he came to that. Maybe it's true, but nobody's really explained how that number was arrived at. That's been dropped. But so now we're talking about actually future deliveries. Like if we send you more weapons, then that has to be regarded as payment, or may be regarded as payment. That's, again, I saw that language, may. So what does that mean? Is if the Ukrainians agree to, or is it just if the U.S. agrees to it? That's a huge difference. We need to find out about this. But all in all, it seems like it's not nearly as outrageous a kind of agreement that the Americans were pushing earlier, which would have been gone down in history as one of the most, rapacious and unfair treaties ever foisted upon a country. Now it's, I think in the end, it's not what Ukraine wants. If they had freedom, any country wants to have economic sovereignty and make agreements with different countries, for different kinds of natural resources, because you want to look around and see who gives you the best deal, right? And you want to have, you just want to have autonomy, but this agreement takes that autonomy, that sovereignty away. And it's a forever agreement. It's just that all natural resources are going to be at least under the partial control of the U.S. forever in Ukraine. And that's obviously a real surrender of sovereignty by Ukraine to the U.S. Now, they may be just bargaining, and I think probably with some good reason, that this will never be implemented. Well, first of all, the war has to end, but even when the war does end someday, Trump will be out of office probably, and maybe the next administration will tear it up.
Do you think that Russia would be okay with this? Like, will this affect Russia's calculus if the idea is that, okay, they have this mineral deal and they can extract the minerals and pay the Ukrainians in weapons? That's clearly not okay. This makes Ukraine essentially a vassal state of the U.S. It becomes our little pet that we have to protect. That's right on the border of Russia.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what actually the U.S. administration officials are saying. There's no explicit security agreement in this treaty that we know of. That was something the Ukrainians were asking for, but it was not included within the treaty. Again, as far as we know, according to the document that's been published. What the U.S. is saying is that there's an implicit security agreement, because now, we have this incentive to help them out. And if there ever is a ceasefire, we'll have our guys on the ground, and the Russians will never want to, our engineers and let's say, oil executives or whatever, they're going to be on the ground, and the Russians will be careful about firing missiles into Ukraine because they don't want to kill any of our people. This is what the U.S. administration is saying. I'm sure that the Russians are looking at this and saying, this is a bad sign. It looks like, this whole thing's falling apart. I think the Russians were always very realistic. If you listen to what they were saying, they said, let's talk, let's do what we can. But they kept on saying, hey, we got a long ways to go. And then you were getting these absurdly optimistic statements from the U.S. side. It's just like, yeah, there's a deal just right around the corner. And we've been hearing that for weeks now. And it was always silly. And the Russians were saying, no, this is hard. This takes time. And, let's just do what we can. They were hoping that at least they'd get the embassies restaffed and get a normalization of relations. And, it's not clear that any progress really has been made in that one area where progress clearly could be made. It's not like you have to twist the arms of the Ukrainians and the Russians to do that. It's just like if the U.S. wants to do it, they could. But we haven't seen any progress yet. And maybe it will be. It's good that they've had talks, but, let's see some results.
It's worrying.
Yeah.
For these natural resources that are in Ukraine that we want to extract, doesn't the U.S. have these natural resources here? We're a huge country with a lot of land.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we're talking also about, revitalizing the U.S. economy. Would it make sense to build the mining infrastructures here and employ Americans? I mean, isn't that part of America first and make America great again for Trump? Why does he want to go and do this deal here in Ukraine that's going to get us tied to Ukraine, that's at war with the largest nuclear superpower in the world, where we have to go and invest in here, and neither party likes us. The Ukrainians don't like us. The Russians don't like us. Yeah. Just get out of there, man. And then who knows if we're going to be able to get these resources anyways. You invest in this country, employ the Ukrainians there. Why don't they just build it here in the United States?
Yeah.
Or is there something that only Ukraine has?
Right. There really isn't a huge need for anything that Ukraine has. There's nothing that Ukraine has, to my knowledge, that we don't have. We do have rare earth minerals. We haven't really developed the capacity to extract them. That takes a lot of time and a lot of money. The Chinese have, and that's, why they provide a very large proportion of rare earth minerals to the world market. Actually, they're now denying them to the U.S. because of this trade war. So that's a problem. It's not a matter of need. It's just, you could say it's greed. It's to say that, probably whatever is extracted from Ukraine, whether it's natural gas or rare earth minerals, it would probably be sold to Europe. And, you can make some money off of that. Europe is natural resource poor. And so Ukraine, within the European continent is relatively rich, but, by world standards, it's nothing exceptional. So that's what you could see. Yeah, maybe they can make some money off of this. Again, this is before you really see some returns on your investment. It would have to be years in the future and have to be following a real, a long-term ceasefire. I think it's really about, putting a feather in Trump's cap. He really wants to say that he did something, he has some sort of achievement to show. He says that, look, I solved this problem. Okay, they're still fighting. I tried to knock their heads together and they just wouldn't listen, which of course is silly because you're on the Ukrainian side actively involved in attacking the Russians. I just get sick of this pretense that the U.S. is somehow a neutral third party. It's just really silly. They're not. But that's the way he talks. So I say, we have worked out this great deal, so at least we're not going to be paying for this anymore. They're going to be paying us for, the arms that we send them. Now, that's not really even possible because Ukraine is broke. So it's probably going to be, we're going to lend them money and then they're going to buy the arms from us and they'll never be able to pay back the loan. Something like that's going to happen.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a feather in his cap. I guess maybe to a superficial observer, they'll just be like, oh, great, we got this deal. Now we own Ukraine resources. It's like a third grade monopoly mentality.
Yeah. Well, but there are a lot of superficial observers, let's be honest. It's still, it's not going to convince, it'll be a minority of supporters, maybe a majority of his supporters, but a minority of the population that's going to believe this was something real.
Right. Yeah, I just feel like if he decided to invest in building a huge refinery or a mining facility in the United States, that would be quite popular. People, I think there's a desire for that here in the U.S. Like, okay, good, the engines are churning again in the United States. You visually see that. Mm-hmm. I don't see why, but instead, he thinks the better plan is to build one in a war-torn country that's actively engaged in a war with the largest military superpower or nuclear superpower in the world. It just
Yeah.
seems insane to me.
Right. Well, he's been fixated on this idea that, we need to profit from these conflicts or, these areas of the world where the U.S. is heavily involved. And that we've been kind of suckers, we've been taken to the cleaners by different countries. And he looks at Ukraine the same, they took $350 billion of ours. And again, I don't know where he got that figure, but so it's something that clearly matters to him. If you remember, it was about a year ago, there was that bill, that $61 billion bill of support for Ukraine was held up by the Republican Congress with Trump support. And I think he had maybe one change that he made more of it into loans, and then he bragged about that. But again, these are loans that they're never going to pay back. And then he ended up supporting it. So I think that should be a warning. You're like, yeah, he opposed further aid to Ukraine, but then he supported it. And, right now it sounds like he's opposing further aid to Ukraine, but he may end up, I think he probably will end up supporting it because, yeah, he does want a deal. But the other thing, let's not forget, he would rather have a ceasefire. I think it's true. But he also is terrified of the idea of a kind of a an Afghanistan-like ending to this conflict with the Russians just marching on his watch, just marching across to Kiev or to Odessa or something like that. And I really don't think he wants that to happen. And if it becomes clear that that may really happen, he'll just pull out all stops to stop him. That's my fear. Maybe he'll show a certain amount of sense and just realize, okay, well, we lost this one. But I don't think he wants to see it. Now, if he had just washed his hands of it at the beginning and tried to agree to the Russian terms, he could have said that, I think it would have been torpedoed by the Ukrainians and by the Europeans. But he would say, okay, look, we agreed to this. They would have stopped right here, at these 4 oblasts if you had listened to me. Now they're marching there. That's your problem. You didn't listen to me. And he could really make that argument. Now that he's sort of involved himself in it again, he says, he's reached this great deal, so he has this incentive. When they're marching, they're not just taking Kiev, but they're also taking that territory that is supposed to make America rich. And it puts them in a real bind.
So do you think this mineral deal is a serious blow to any type of negotiated peace settlement now?
Yeah. I think it is. Again, it changes the incentive somewhat, and then it also just gives Trump an excuse to say, okay, yeah, I reached a deal. It wasn't the original deal, but I'm so clever. I worked on this over here, and that kind of led to this deal here, and so here I am, the deal maker, another success.
Right, and in order to protect the deal, he's got to arm Ukraine more and get more involved in the war.
Right, that's my fear. Now, it's just never completely safe to say what Trump's going to do, but that appears to be where things are headed now, unfortunately.
I mean, couldn't he, in his talks with Putin, and I think Russia would be open to having joint venture projects. I think they even said this, that like, look, just because we have this territory, and look at Russia, we have the most territory in the world. There's a lot of resources here that we can on joint ventures, develop together and both profit from. And that include whatever territory that they take from Ukraine. So that it's not necessarily a loss for Trump. I mean, you can make that. Yeah. That's the big deal that you want to make.
Yeah,
a deal with Russia.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Russia has the most natural resources of any country in the world, by far. The second most is the U.S. So like you're saying, it actually makes more sense if you invest in American natural resources. And Ukraine is it's, I don't know, what, number 10 or something like it. It's something, but it's very insignificant compared to both the U.S. and Russia. Now, with this territory that the Russians have taken in Ukraine, actually, if you add that territory to the Russian total, Russia becomes, its lead, it increases so that it has twice as much in the way of resources than the U.S. does, which is a distant second. So there are many more and better opportunities within Russia. If you're talking about business deals, it would make sense to go to Russia. And there clearly was some talk about that. And I think some genuine interest, but it's looking like that's not going to happen. Maybe, we'll see a change of course, but, I think it's
Right.
very doubtful now.